The next morning, Andrei woke with an unusual feeling, something that took him a moment to identify as anticipation. He found himself eager to see Elena again, to continue their conversation. But when he arrived at her cottage, he discovered her in tears. She was sitting in her garden, holding a letter, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Narrator: has Elena been living in pretense? Could Andrei be right? As Andrei approached, Elena looked up and smiled through her tears. Oh, Andrei. Perfect timing. I could use a friend right now. What's wrong? He asked, surprised by his own concern. This letter. It's from my great-nephew in Canada. He's been diagnosed with cancer. He's only 35, with 2 small children. Elena wiped her eyes but made no attempt to hide her sadness. I'm crying because I love him so much, and I'm scared for him. I'm crying because his children might grow up without their father, like I grew up without mine. I'm crying because life can be so brutally unfair. Andrei sat down beside her, unsure what to say. But you know what else I'm feeling. Elena continued. Grateful. Grateful that he trusted me enough to share this news. Grateful that modern medicine gives him fighting chances my own family never had. Grateful that he has a wife who loves him fiercely and friends who will support him. Grateful that even if the worst happens, those children will have had a father who adored them completely for their first years of life. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. You see, my dear, I'm not happy because I'm naive about suffering. I'm happy because I refuse to let suffering have the final word. That afternoon, as Andrei sat in the village trying to write his article, he found himself staring at a blank page. Every sentence he attempted felt wrong, inadequate, almost sacrilegious. He had come to expose Elena as a fraud, but instead he had discovered something that challenged every cynical assumption he held about human nature. He had expected to find denial and delusion, but instead he had found a woman who faced reality with more courage than anyone he had ever met. His phone rang, his editor in Bucharest, demanding to know where his story was. It's complicated, Andrei found himself saying. Complicated how? You said you were investigating some old woman who claims to be happy all the time. How hard can it be to show that she's either lying or crazy? Andrei looked out the window at Elena's cottage, where warm light glowed from the windows. She's neither lying nor crazy. I don't know how to explain it. She's something else entirely. Well, figure it out. I need copy by tomorrow morning. That evening, Andrei knocked on Elena's door again. I need to ask you something, he said when she welcomed him in. What you've shared with me, it's beautiful, but it's also challenging. If people read about your approach to life, some will say you're just lucky, that you haven't faced real hardship. Others will say you're encouraging people to accept injustice, to be passive in the face of problems that need to be solved. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Those are fair concerns. Let me tell you about my neighbor, Mrs. Vasilescu. Mrs. Vasilescu lived in the house across the street until she died 5 years ago. She was exactly my age, and she had experienced very similar losses. Husband dead young, children lost to illness and accident. But she made different choices than I did. Elena poured tea for both of them, her movements graceful despite her age. Where I chose to look for reasons to be grateful, she chose to catalogue reasons to be bitter. Where I chose to see my losses as proof of how much love I had experienced, she chose to see them as evidence that the universe was cruel. Where I chose to reach out to others, she chose to withdraw into isolation. Elena sipped her tea, her expression sad but not judgmental. For 40 years, we lived across the street from each other. For 40 years, I would wave good morning and she would glare back. I would invite her for holidays and she would refuse. I would offer help when she was sick and she would slam the door. That must have been frustrating, Andrei said. At first, yes. But then I realized that she was living proof of something important. We all face suffering, but we choose what to do with it. Mrs. Vasilescu used her pain as a reason to become smaller, angrier, more afraid. I used mine as a reason to become larger, more compassionate, braver. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking across at the house where her former neighbor had lived. She died alone, bitter, convinced that life had cheated her. I will die surrounded by people who love me, grateful for every moment I've been given. We started from the same place, but we chose different destinations. So how does someone begin? Andre asked. If someone reading my article is convinced by your example but doesn't know where to start, what would you tell them? Elena's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a teacher who had been waiting for exactly this question. Start small, she said immediately. Don't try to transform your entire worldview overnight. That's a recipe for failure and self-judgment. She moved to her kitchen counter and pulled out a simple notebook, the kind children use for school. Get one of these. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. Every morning, before you check your phone, before you read the news, before you let the world tell you what to think about, write down 3 things you noticed yesterday that were beautiful, kind, or meaningful. She opened the notebook to a random page. Look, yesterday I wrote, the way the light came through the kitchen window and made patterns on the floor. The letter from young Teodora telling me about her art school acceptance. The sound of Mrs. Ionescu laughing with her grandchildren in her yard. Elena flipped to another page. The week before, the smell of rain on dry earth after the drought. The way the postal worker took extra time to help the elderly man understand his pension letter. The feeling of the first tomato of the season, still warm from the sun. She closed the notebook and handed it to Andre. It seems simple, maybe even silly. But here's what happens. When you train your brain to look for beauty, kindness, and meaning, you start to see more of it. Not because the world changes, but because your attention changes. You become a person who notices light instead of only seeing darkness. But what about when terrible things happen? Andre pressed. What about when someone you love dies, or you lose your job, or you receive devastating news? Isn't this just toxic positivity? Elena's expression grew serious, almost stern. If someone tried to tell me to just think positive while I was burying my children, I would have thrown them out of my house. What I'm talking about is not denial. It's not pretending that bad things are good. It's not forcing fake smiles or refusing to acknowledge pain. She leaned forward, her voice intense. What I'm talking about is this, even in the darkest moments, even when you're drowning in grief or fear or anger, there are still tiny lights. Maybe it's the friend who brings you soup. Maybe it's the stranger who holds the door. Maybe it's the way your body keeps breathing even when your heart is broken. Elena stood and moved to a small shelf where she kept photographs. When my Ioana died, I spent weeks unable to see anything but darkness. But even then, even in the worst grief of my life, there were moments. The neighbor who mowed my grass without being asked. The priest who sat with me in silence instead of offering empty platitudes. The way Ioana's favorite flowers bloomed that spring as if she was sending me a message. She picked up a faded photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile. Gratitude practice isn't about ignoring pain. It's about refusing to let pain be the only story. It's about training yourself to see the full picture, the beauty and the terror, the love and the loss, the meaning and the mystery. Andre found himself staring at the photograph of Ioana, thinking about his own losses, his own reasons for cynicism. I lost my father when I was 15, he heard himself saying. Cancer. It was brutal, long and painful and unfair. He was a good man, you know? Kind, honest, hardworking. And he suffered terribly at the end. Elena sat down beside him, her presence somehow both gentle and strong. I'm sorry, she said simply. Tell me about him. And to his surprise, Andre found himself talking, not about his father's death, but about his life. About the way he would wake up early on Saturdays to make pancakes. About his terrible jokes that somehow always made people laugh. About the way he taught Andre to change a tire, to tie knots, to treat everyone with dignity regardless of their station in life. He sounds like he was a wonderful father, Elena said when Andre finished. He was. That's what made losing him so. It felt like proof that the universe doesn't care about goodness. That random, horrible things happen to the best people. Elena nodded slowly. And that's true. Random, horrible things do happen to the best people. But here's what I've learned. Random, wonderful things also happen to people who don't deserve them. Random kindness, random beauty, random love. She gestured toward the photograph of Ioana. I could focus on the randomness of the drunk driver who killed my daughter. Or I could focus on the randomness of meeting Dimitri at a village dance, the randomness of having healthy children when so many couples struggle with infertility, the randomness of being born in a time and place where I was free to love whom I chose. Andrei spent 3 more days in Luminia, and each day brought new revelations. He watched Elena comfort a young mother whose baby wouldn't stop crying, not with advice or solutions, but simply by holding the child and humming softly until both mother and baby relaxed. He saw her spend an entire afternoon helping an elderly man write a letter to his estranged son, patiently drafting and redrafting until the words carried exactly the right tone of love and regret. Most remarkably, he witnessed Elena's interaction with Gheorghe, the grumpy mailman, who arrived one morning obviously drunk and belligerent. You and your stupid happiness, Gheorghe slurred, swaying on his feet. Easy to be happy when you don't have to work, when people bring you things, when you just sit in your garden all day like some kind of saint. Instead of defending herself or becoming offended, Elena looked at Gheorghe with such compassion that Andrei felt his heart crack open a little more. You're right, she said gently. I'm fortunate in many ways. And you look like you're carrying a very heavy burden today. Would you like to tell me about it? The simple acknowledgement and invitation broke something in Gheorghe. He began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from decades of accumulated pain. Elena guided him to her garden chair and brought him water, saying nothing, just being present while he wept. Eventually, the story came out. Gheorghe's wife had left him the week before, taking their grandson, whom he adored, to live with her sister in another city. He was drinking to numb the pain of losing the 2 people who made his life meaningful. Elena listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize his pain. When he finished, she said simply, "That sounds like the kind of loss that would drive anyone to desperate measures. No wonder you're hurting so much." They sat in silence for a while, and then Elena began to speak, not about gratitude or positive thinking, but about the specific, practical steps Gheorghe might take to rebuild the relationships he had damaged. She offered to help him write a letter to his wife, to watch his house while he visited them, to be a character reference if needed. By the time Gheorghe left, he was sober, hopeful, and had a concrete plan for moving forward. How did you know exactly what to say? Andrei asked afterward. I didn't, Elena replied. I just listened for what he needed most. Sometimes people need advice, sometimes they need practical help, sometimes they just need someone to witness their pain without trying to fix it immediately. When Andrei finally sat down to write his article, the words flowed like water breaking through a dam. But the story that emerged was nothing like what he had planned. Instead of an exposé of rural delusion, he wrote about a woman who had discovered something revolutionary, that happiness was not a destination but a practice, not a feeling but a choice, not a gift but a skill that could be developed through intentional daily actions. His article, titled The Woman Who Chose Joy, Lessons from a Village Philosopher, was published 3 weeks later and immediately went viral. Within days, Andrei's inbox was flooded with messages from readers who had been moved, challenged, and inspired by Elena's story. But the most profound response came from an unexpected source. Gheorghe, the mailman. 2 months after the article was published, Andrei received a letter, not an email, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the postal service. The return address was Luminia. Dear Mr. Moldovan, it began in careful handwriting. You don't know me, but I am the drunk mailman from your article about Bunic Elena. I wanted you to know what has happened since that day you wrote about. Andrei leaned back in his chair in his Bucharest apartment, curious despite himself. After Elena helped me write that letter to my wife, I stopped drinking. Not all at once, I'm not a miracle, but I started going to the meetings she found for me in the next town. I followed her advice about small steps, about finding one thing each day to be grateful for. The letter continued for 3 pages, describing Gheorghe's gradual reconciliation with his wife, his renewed relationship with his grandson, and his transformation from the village's most pessimistic resident to someone who had begun helping others in his delivery route. But here's the thing that will interest you, the letter concluded. I'm not the only one. Your article has been passed around our village and the neighboring villages. People are starting to change. Mrs. Petrescu started a community garden where people can grow vegetables together. The teenagers have organized a group to help elderly residents with household tasks. Even Father Nikolai has changed his sermons to focus more on gratitude and less on sin. Andrei set down the letter, stunned. He had written about one woman's personal philosophy, but somehow it had sparked a movement. His phone rang. It was his editor. Andrei, we need to talk. That happiness article of yours, it's been shared more than anything we've published in 5 years. We're getting calls from television stations, radio programs, book publishers. They all want to interview you about this Elena woman. A month later, Andrei found himself driving back to Lumania, this time accompanied by a television crew. He was nervous about exposing Elena to media attention, worried that the circus of cameras and interviews might disturb the peace she had cultivated. But when he arrived at her cottage, Elena greeted the film crew with the same warm hospitality she had shown him months earlier. Welcome, welcome. I've made extra soup and borrowed chairs from the neighbors. Are you hungry from your journey? As the crew set up their equipment, Andrei pulled Elena aside. Are you sure about this? Once this interview airs, your quiet life might never be the same. People might start showing up here, wanting to meet you, asking you to solve their problems. Elena smiled, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like anticipation rather than concern. My dear boy, do you think I've been keeping this wisdom to myself all these years because I wanted to hoard it? If my story can help people find their own path to happiness, then sharing it is the most grateful thing I can do. The interview was unlike anything Andrei had ever witnessed. The television host, a sophisticated woman from Bucharest who was known for her sharp, probing questions, found herself completely disarmed by Elena's gentle honesty. Mrs. Popescu, the host began, our viewers are going to want to know, is it really possible for someone who hasn't experienced the level of loss you have to achieve this kind of contentment? Elena considered the question seriously. I think loss teaches us about the preciousness of what we have, but it's not the only teacher. A young person who pays attention to the beauty around them, who practices gratitude before tragedy strikes, who chooses kindness when they could choose selfishness, that person is already on the path to deep happiness. But what about people who say this is all just privilege? That it's easy to be philosophical about suffering when your basic needs are met? Ah, Elena said, her expression growing more serious. That's an important question. You're right that hunger, homelessness, genuine danger, these things make it much harder to focus on gratitude. I've never had to worry about where my next meal would come from, and that is indeed a privilege. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. But I've also known people who had nothing, truly nothing, who still found ways to be kind, to notice beauty, to help others. And I've known people with everything who were miserable because they focused only on what they lacked. Happiness isn't about circumstances, though circumstances certainly matter. It's about what you do with whatever circumstances you find yourself in. The television interview aired on a Sunday evening and was watched by over 2 million people. By Monday morning, Elena's phone was ringing constantly with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and visits from people who wanted to learn her methods. But Elena, true to her character, handled the attention with the same grace she brought to everything else. She established what she called visiting hours, 2 hours each afternoon when people could come to her cottage for conversation. She limited the number of visitors to ensure that each person received individual attention, and she refused all offers of payment. Happiness shared is happiness multiplied, she would tell anyone who asked why she didn't charge for her time. The moment I start treating wisdom as a commodity, I stop being wise. Within 6 months, Lumania had been transformed. The small village that had previously been known only for its pottery and wheat fields became a destination for people seeking something deeper than tourist attractions. They came from cities and villages across Romania, then from neighboring countries, and eventually from around the world. Business people burned out from corporate careers, students struggling with depression and anxiety, elderly couples facing health crises, young parents overwhelmed by responsibility, all drawn by stories of a woman who had found genuine contentment in the face of overwhelming loss. But Elena's influence extended far beyond her individual conversations. The village itself began to embody her philosophy. Local businesses started what they called gratitude initiatives. The bakery began offering free bread to anyone who couldn't afford it, with customers anonymously paying for others' loaves. The small hotel started a program where guests could leave notes of appreciation for future visitors, creating a chain of kindness that spanned continents. The school principal, inspired by Elena's methods, implemented a daily gratitude practice where students would share one thing they appreciated about their classmates. Bullying incidents dropped dramatically, and test scores improved as children became more focused and emotionally regulated. Most remarkably, the village's elderly residents began what they called the Wisdom Circle, weekly gatherings where they would share life lessons with younger community members. Elena had shown them that their experiences of loss, struggle, and survival were not burdens to be hidden but treasures to be shared. Andrei documented all of these changes in a series of follow-up articles that eventually became a book, The Luminia Effect: How One Woman's Gratitude Practice Transformed an Entire Community. But it was during one of his visits, nearly a year after his first meeting with Elena, that he witnessed something that would change his understanding of her philosophy forever. Andrei arrived in Luminia on a grey October morning to find the village subdued. Elena wasn't in her garden, and when he knocked on her door, it was answered by her great-niece, Maria, who had travelled from Cluj. "She's in the hospital," Maria explained, her eyes red from crying. "The doctors found a mass in her brain. It's not good, Andrei. They say she has weeks, maybe a month." Andrei felt the world tilt sideways. Elena, who had become a symbol of indestructible joy, was facing the ultimate test of her own philosophy. At the hospital, he found Elena propped up in bed, thinner and frailer than he had ever seen her, but her eyes still bright with that familiar spark of life. "Andrei!" she exclaimed when she saw him. "How wonderful! I was just telling the nurses about you. Did you know that Nurse Daniela there has been writing in a gratitude journal ever since she read your article? She says it's helped her manage the stress of this job." Andrei sat down beside her bed, struggling to find words. "Elena, how are you? How are you handling this?" Elena smiled, the same radiant smile he remembered from their first meeting. "I'm dying, dear boy. We all are, every day, from the moment we're born. I'm just doing it a little faster than most people." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "But you want to know if I'm still grateful, don't you? If I'm still choosing happiness when faced with my own mortality?" Andrei nodded, unable to speak. "Yesterday," Elena said, "I woke up and my first thought was panic. Pure, animal fear of dying. I lay here in this strange bed, surrounded by machines, feeling sorry for myself and angry at the unfairness of it all." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "I let myself feel all of that. I didn't try to push it away or tell myself I should be more positive. I grieved for all the things I won't get to see, the grandchildren I'll never meet, the springs I won't witness, the people I won't be able to help." Her voice grew stronger. "But then I started my gratitude practice, right here in this hospital bed. And you know what I found myself grateful for? The fact that I've had 78 years of sunrises. The fact that I got to love deeply and be loved in return. The fact that strangers now come to my village and find hope because of conversations we've shared." Elena continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had discovered something profound. "I'm grateful that I won't die alone, that I have people who love me, people who will miss me, people whose lives have been touched by mine. I'm grateful that I'm not in pain, that my mind is still clear, that I can still appreciate the kindness of the hospital staff." She squeezed Andrei's hand. "But most of all, I'm grateful that I learned the secret of happiness before it was too late. So many people die with regrets, wishing they had lived differently. I have no regrets, Andrei. None. Every choice I made, every loss I survived, every moment of joy I experienced, it all led to this moment, and this moment is exactly as it should be." Andrei felt tears streaming down his face. "But aren't you afraid? Aren't you sad to leave all of this behind?" Elena's expression grew tender. "Of course I'm afraid. Of course I'm sad. But fear and sadness are not the opposite of gratitude, they're part of it. I'm afraid because life has been so precious. I'm sad because I've experienced so much beauty. My emotions aren't contradicting each other, they're harmonizing. She pointed to the window, where afternoon light was painting the hospital walls in shades of gold. Look at that light, Andre. In an hour, it will be gone. Does that make it less beautiful? Does the fact that flowers bloom and then wither make them less miraculous? Does the fact that we love people we will eventually lose make that love less real? Andre looked at the light, really looked at it, and for the first time in his life understood what Elena had been trying to teach him all along. The temporary nature of things doesn't diminish their value, he whispered. It enhances it. Exactly, Elena smiled. I am grateful for every single day I've been given, and I'm grateful that I'm conscious enough to appreciate the gift of having lived at all. How many people get to experience love, beauty, friendship, laughter, even sorrow? How miraculous is it that we get to feel anything at all? Elena died 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, with the same grace she had brought to living. Her great-niece reported that her last words were, "Thank you for everything. It was all so beautiful." Her funeral was unlike anything Luminia had ever seen. People came from across Romania and beyond, hundreds of individuals whose lives had been touched by her story. But instead of a samba gathering, it became a celebration of gratitude. At Elena's request, instead of eulogies focusing on loss, speakers shared stories of what they were grateful for having learned from her. Instead of flowers, people brought written gratitude that were read aloud and then planted in Elena's garden, creating what became known as the Gratitude Grove. Andre delivered the final reading, not from scripture or poetry, but from Elena's own gratitude journal, the final entry she had made the night before she died. I am grateful for the rain on the hospital windows. I am grateful for the young doctor who held my hand during the scary test. I am grateful for the phone call from little Theodora, who wanted to tell me about her art scholarship. I am grateful for the way the nurses laughed together at the station. It reminds me that joy persists even in places touched by sorrow. I am grateful for the strange peace I feel, knowing that my story will continue in the hearts of everyone who chooses gratitude over bitterness, love over fear, hope over despair. As Andre finished reading, something extraordinary happened. Without any coordination or planning, people throughout the crowd began sharing their own gratitude aloud. I'm grateful for the way Elena taught me to see beauty in ordinary moments. I'm grateful for learning that grief and joy can coexist. I'm grateful for understanding that happiness is a choice I can make every day. The sharing continued for over an hour, with voices rising and falling in a spontaneous symphony of appreciation. Children spoke alongside elderly adults, visitors from distant countries expressed gratitude in broken Romanian, and even the most reserved villagers found themselves moved to participate. In the months following Elena's death, something remarkable began to happen. People who had visited Luminia started implementing gratitude practices in their own communities. The businessman from Germany began holding weekly appreciation meetings at his company. The teacher from France started a gratitude journal program at her school. The elderly couple from Japan created a neighborhood group dedicated to noticing and sharing daily beauties. Andre received letters and emails from around the world, all describing the same phenomenon. Elena's simple practice was spreading like seeds on the wind, taking root in the most unexpected places. One letter particularly moved him. It came from a young mother in Canada who had been struggling with severe postpartum depression. I read your article during the darkest period of my life, when I couldn't see any reason to keep going. Elena's story gave me a concrete practice to try when positive thinking felt impossible. I started with gratitude for the smallest things, the way my baby's hand felt in mine, the taste of coffee, the fact that another day was ending. Slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, the world began to have color again. I'm not Elena, I still struggle with difficult days, but I now have tools that work. More importantly, I'm teaching my daughter to notice beauty from the very beginning of her life. Another letter came from a prisoner in Australia. I've been in prison for 8 years for a crime I committed when I was young and stupid. I was full of anger and self-pity until someone shared a copy of your article. Elena's story helped me understand that I could choose how to spend my time here. I started looking for things to be grateful for, the guard who treats us with dignity, the way sunlight comes through the cell window, the letters from my sister who hasn't given up on me. Now I help other inmates start their own gratitude practices. Elena's influence is even reaching us here, in the place society has forgotten. 5 years after Elena's death, Andrei returned to Luminia to write a final article about her lasting influence. The village had changed dramatically. It was now home to a small retreat center where people came to learn about gratitude-based living, a community garden that served as a model for sustainable agriculture, and a school that had become famous for its emotional intelligence curriculum. But the most profound change was in the people themselves. The villagers who had known Elena carried her philosophy in their daily interactions. They had become teachers without meaning to, spreading her wisdom through simple acts of noticing, appreciating, and choosing joy over bitterness. Andrei sat in Elena's garden, now maintained by the entire community as a memorial and meeting place. Her cottage had been converted into a small library where people could read her gratitude journals, study her methods, and write their own reflections. As he sat there, writing his final article about Elena's legacy, Andrei realized that he himself had become proof of her philosophy's power. The cynical journalist who had arrived 5 years earlier to debunk a happiness fraud had been transformed into someone who began each day by writing 3 gratitude, who looked for opportunities to lift others up, who had learned to find joy in both ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor. "How's the article coming? We need it for tomorrow's deadline." Andrei looked around the garden where Elena had taught him to see the world differently, where he had learned that happiness was not a destination but a practice, not a feeling but a choice, not a gift but a skill. He began to type. "The secret of happiness, I have learned, is not found in having more or being more or achieving more. It is found in the radical act of paying attention to what already is. It is found in choosing gratitude when gratitude feels impossible, in looking for light when darkness seems overwhelming, in recognizing that our capacity to love, to appreciate, to find meaning in the midst of chaos, is itself the greatest miracle we will ever witness." Elena Popescu understood this truth not because she was special or gifted or lucky, but because she was willing to do the daily work of choosing joy. She proved that happiness is not the absence of suffering but the presence of gratitude, not the avoidance of difficulty but the embrace of whatever comes with open arms and an open heart. Her legacy lives on not in monuments or institutions, but in every person who decides to write down 3 things they're grateful for, in every individual who chooses to see beauty in ordinary moments, in every human being who refuses to let bitterness have the final word. The village of Luminia has become a symbol of what's possible when one person's intentional gratitude creates ripples that eventually become waves. But Elena's real monument is not a place you can visit. It's a way of being you can choose, wherever you are, whatever you face, however difficult your circumstances might be. The secret of happiness, she taught us, is not a secret at all. It's a practice, available to anyone brave enough to try it, persistent enough to continue it, and generous enough to share it with others. And that practice begins with a simple question: what am I grateful for today? As Andrei finished writing, the sun was setting over Luminia, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that seemed to echo Elena's voice. There is always something beautiful to notice, always something to appreciate, always a reason to choose joy over despair. He closed his laptop, pulled out a small notebook, and wrote, "Today I am grateful for the privilege of telling Elena's story. I am grateful for the way her wisdom has transformed my life. I am grateful for the reminder that happiness is not something we find but something we create, not something we receive but something we give, not something we achieve but something we practice every single day until it becomes who we are." The story of Elena Popescu had ended, but the story of everyone who chose to follow her example was just beginning. The end. This story is dedicated to everyone who has the courage to choose gratitude in the face of loss, hope in the midst of despair, and joy despite the inevitable sorrows of human existence. May Elena's example remind us all that happiness is not a destination but a journey, not a feeling but a choice, not a gift but a practice available to anyone brave enough to try. Thanks for watching. Kindly like and subscribe.